Hi there, I'm Rachel from So Joyful Studio, and this is the tutorial for my All Wrapped Up for the Holidays pattern. This pattern includes 2 quilted stockings, a mini block, and a table runner. We'll be walking through each one step by step together. To begin, print your templates at 100% scale. Double check after printing that the 1-inch square on the template measures 1 inch. Cut along the bold black lines, except where the tabs are located. Make sure to cut around the gray tabs like you see me doing here. Next, tape together your template pieces by aligning the tabs and diamonds as described on the pattern pieces. Before cutting our fabric, cut out the fabric labels located at the end of the pattern. When cutting the background fabric for stocking 1, be sure to also cut all pieces listed for the mini block. Let's begin cutting our fabric. Start by cutting the width of fabric strips listed. Width of fabric is measured from selvage to selvage, so you'll be cutting like you see me doing here. After you've finished cutting the width of fabric strips, subcut those strips into the needed pieces as listed in the table in the pattern. For example, for stocking 2, take 3 width of fabric strips 2.5 inches wide and subcut into 48 2.5-inch squares. Label your pieces and set them to the side. I like to use these clear storage bins to keep my pieces organized. If it isn't already, fold your lining fabric in half, right sides together or wrong sides together, before cutting out template 1. That way, you'll be sure to end up with 2 stocking pieces that are mirror images of each other. When using templates, I prefer to use pattern weights such as these, but you're welcome to either pin the template to the fabric before cutting, or you can use a temporary spray adhesive or basting spray to stick the template to the fabric. The pattern weights you see me using here are just old pieces of tile. Anything heavy will do if you want to use that method. Again, once finished cutting, you should have 2 stocking pieces that are mirror images of each other. And finally, cut your batting to size. For the block and the stockings, you should have 2 pieces of batting. First, we'll begin by making our angle subunits. Mark a diagonal line corner to corner on the wrong side of all A2 squares. I like to use a Hera marker for this, but you could also use a chalk pen or a disappearing ink pen, whatever you prefer. Next, cut on the diagonal line you just marked to make the required number of triangles as listed in the pattern for the size you are making. To save time, you can skip marking the diagonal line and simply cut all A2 squares corner to corner. For the mini block and stocking 1, you'll end up with 8 triangles, and for stocking 2 and the table runner, you'll end up with 96 triangles. Fold these triangles in half and finger press to find the center of the long edge of the triangle. Also finger press the center of all BG2 rectangles. Sew a pair of triangles to either side of one BG2 piece, aligning the center lines that you just found. Press the seam away from BG2 and towards the triangle. Another tip to save time is to skip marking the center lines of the triangles and BG2 pieces and place your triangle so that it overhangs the end of BG2 by about 1/8 of an inch on both ends. After pressing, trim the blocks to 2.5 inches square. One option to do this is to use a 2.5-inch square ruler, aligning the diagonal line down the center of BG2 before trimming. Another option for trimming if you do not have a 2.5-inch square ruler is to mark the center line of BG2. This will be 1/4 inch from the edge of the triangles. Once marked, align the corner of any square ruler you have with the diagonal line and verify that the point 2.5 inches in from both directions is within the edges of the square and also aligned with the diagonal line that you marked on the center of BG2. Rotate your subunit and ruler and align the 2.5-inch line with the ruler along the edges of the square, making sure that the diagonal line runs through the center of piece BG2. Trimming these angle subunits can be a bit tricky, but not to worry if they are not perfect. Once the subunits are sewn into the block, the corners of piece BG2 do not meet up with any other pieces, and slight imperfections won't be noticeable. Next are the center strips for stocking 2 and the table runner. Start by aligning one B1 piece with 2 BG3 pieces on either side. Sew these pieces together using scant 1/4 inch seams to make one strip set. Press the seams in towards piece B1. Next, square off one end of your strip set. From the squared off end, subcut the strip set into 12 1 1/2 inch wide center strips. Center strips should measure 1.5 inches by 2.5 inches. Now let's make the center strip for the mini block and stocking 1. Align one B1 piece with 2 BG3 pieces on either side. Sew together with scant 1/4 inch seams and press seams toward B1. To make the center squares for all versions of the pattern, align 2 BG4 pieces on top and bottom of one center strip. Sew together to create the center square and press the seams out toward the BG4 pieces. Once pressed, your center square should measure 2.5 inches square. For stocking 2 and the table runner, repeat to make 12 center squares total. To make the snowball units, mark a diagonal line corner to corner on the wrong side of all BG1 squares. You can mark these lines using a hair marker, a disappearing ink pen, or chalk, whichever you prefer. Grab all of your A1 squares. Align one BG1 square with the corner of one A1 square with right sides together. Make sure that you double check the diagonal line is oriented as I've shown here. Sew on the marked diagonal line and trim the corner excess fabric 1/4 inch away from the sewn line. One way I like to save time on trimming these seams is to line up the seams so that they align with one of the lines on your cutting mat. Using a ruler, trim multiple units at a time, 1/4 inch away from the seam. Press seams outward toward the quarter triangle. Next, align one BG1 square with the adjacent corner of the A1 square, right sides together. Make sure the diagonal line is oriented as shown here. Sew on the marked diagonal line and trim the excess corner fabric 1/4 inch away from the sewn line. Press the seam outward toward the corner triangle. Let's begin row assembly for our blocks, starting with the middle row. Align 2 snowball units on either side of one center square and sew together. One tip for making sure that we have perfect points is to ensure that our 1/4 inch seam goes right through the intersection of the 2 diagonal seams of the snowball unit. Here you can see how those 3 seams intersect, creating a perfect point when the seams are pressed. Press the seams out toward the snowball units to create one middle row. For stocking 2 in the table runner, repeat to make 12 middle rows total. Moving along to create the top and bottom rows, align 2 angle subunits on either side of one snowball unit and sew together. For the mini block and stocking 1, repeat to make 2, and for stocking 2 and the table runner, repeat to make 24 top and bottom rows. Press seams in toward the snowball unit. Up next is the inner block. Align 2 top and bottom rows on either side of one middle row. Sew together to make one inner block. Make sure your 1/4 inch seam intersects these other 2 seams just like you did when sewing the middle row together to ensure a perfect point. Here you can see that intersection of the 3 seams. Press the seams in toward the middle row and repeat to make 12 inner blocks for stocking 2 and the table runner. Next up is Unit 1. For stocking 2 and the table runner, set aside 6 inner blocks that will not be used in this step. From there, align 2 BG5 pieces on either side of one inner block. Sew together to make one Unit 1. Press seams out toward BG5 pieces. For stocking 2 and table runner, repeat this section to make 6 Unit 1s. This next section is for the mini block and stocking 1. To make the top and bottom strips, align 2 B2 pieces on either side of 2 BG5 pieces. Sew together and press the seams in toward the BG5 pieces. Align the top and bottom strips on either side of one Unit 1 and sew together. Press the seams out toward the top and bottom strips to finish your mini block quilt top. For stocking 2 and the table runner, grab the 6 inner blocks you set to the side. To make Unit 2, align 1 BG5 piece on the right side of one inner block. Sew together and press the seam out toward BG5. Repeat these steps to make 6 Unit 2s total. To assemble our quilt panels for stocking 2 and the table runner, we'll start by making rows A and B. To make row B, align 1 Unit 2 on the right side of one Unit 1. Sew together and press seam toward Unit 1. Repeat this process to make 6 row Bs total. To make row A, align 3 B2 pieces and 2 BG5 pieces as shown here. Sew together to make 1 row A and press the seams toward BG5 pieces. Repeat to make 8 row A's for stocking 2 or 7 row A's for the table runner. When assembling the quilt panel, for stocking 2 and the table runner, you will be alternating row A and row B. For stocking 2, align 4 row A's and 3 row B's, as you see me doing here. For table runner, align 7 row A's and 6 row B's. Sew the rows together and press the seams toward row A's. Your table runner quilt top is now complete. To create the quilt panel for stocking 1, align BG7 on the left side of one mini block and BG6 on the right side of that mini block. Sew together and press the seams away from the mini block. Align BG8 and BG9 on the top and bottom of this mini block unit. Before sewing them together, make sure to orient this mini block unit that you just made in the direction you want your final stocking to hang. For further clarification, reference the diagrams in the pattern. In this example, my mini block will be on the right so that my stocking toe will be on the left. Once your seams are sewn together, press toward BG8 and BG9 to finish your panel. To begin stocking construction, place your batting piece down on your table. Place your quilt panel on top of your batting piece right side up. Baste your panel to your batting piece using your preferred method. Here I'm showing the basting spray that I like to use. To baste using basting spray, I like to pull up 1/2 of my quilt top, so here pulling 1/2 of my quilt panel up. Then spray the batting with a light dusting of basting spray. Make sure to use something like a scrap piece of paper or cardboard to protect the surface that you're working on. Then evenly smooth back out your quilt top over top of the batting. Note that the basting and quilting process will be the same whether you're making stocking 1 or stocking 2. Now repeat this process on the other half. Once finished basting, use your iron and run it over your quilt top to set the basting spray before quilting. Quilt your panel as desired. Make note that we are not including the backing fabric for the quilting process, just the batting and your quilt panel. Here you can see I like to use a hair marker and ruler to give myself guidelines for quilting before I start the stitching. Next, we'll go ahead and cut out our stocking using our template 1. For stocking 2, place your template face up on one panel. Pin the template piece to your quilt panel or use pattern weights like you see me doing here. Then cut around the edge of the template. It is super important that for the second stocking piece, you place the template face down on the second handle so that we end up with 2 stocking pieces that are mirror images of each other. As you can see here, I'm going to cut both panels out for stocking 1 at the same time. This can also be done for stocking 2. Place the panels wrong sides together so the batting is facing each other. When placing your template onto your quilt panel, align the mini block square on your template with the mini block on your quilt panel. Your template piece may be face down instead of face up, depending on how you aligned your mini block within your quilt panel. Once aligned, cut your template out as I described previously. Sew your quilted stocking pieces right side together and your stocking lining pieces right side together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Leave the top open on both and leave a 6 inch gap along the back edge of the stocking lining pieces. Trim the seam allowance down to a 1/4 inch around the front curve of the toe in order to reduce bulk once we turn it right side out. Do this for both the quilted stocking pieces and the stocking lining. Turn the quilted stocking right side out. Be sure to push all the seams out so that you get a nice curve on the toe and on the heel. You're welcome to use ribbon or twine for the hanging loop, but I like to use fabric that matches my stocking. Cut a 2 inch by 6 inch rectangle. Fold in half lengthwise and finger press, unfold, and then fold the edge to meet that center crease you just made. Repeat on the other side, and then use your iron to press flat. Use an edge stitch or 1/8 inch seam allowance to stitch along the edge of the loop. Insert the quilted stocking that is now right side out inside of the stocking lining that is still inside out. Align the top edges, including the front and back seams. Once aligned, pin or clip in place. Fold your hanging ribbon or fabric loop in half and place the ribbon so that the looped end is hanging down between the quilted stocking and the lining along that back seam line. The raw ends of your fabric loop or ribbon should be even with the top edge of the stocking. Pin or clip in place. like to add a couple more pins or clips around the top edge before stitching, just to make sure everything stays in place, and then sew around the top opening with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Make sure to backstitch over the hanging loop a couple times to add strength. Turn the stocking right side out by pulling the quilted stocking through the 6-inch opening along the back seam of the stocking lining. Stitch the opening in the lining closed using an 1/8 inch seam allowance or edge stitch. Note that this stitching will be inside the stocking, however, if you prefer that it not be visible, use a ladder stitch to hand stitch the opening closed. Push the stocking lining all the way inside the quilted stocking. I like to give the top edge a quick press just to create a crisp edge along the opening, then top stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the circumference of the stocking opening. Make sure that you don't catch the hanging ribbon loop in your stitching. Your quilted stocking is now finished. To finish your mini block, first sew your 2 batting pieces together along the 9-inch edges by butting the 2 pieces together and using a wide zigzag stitch to make a 9-inch square. For both the mini block or the table runner, layer the backing fabric wrong side up, followed by the batting, and then center the mini quilt block or table runner on top right side up. The backing and batting should be slightly larger than the quilt block or table runner. Next, baste using your preferred method. Here I'll be using a basting spray. If using this method, be sure to protect your surface using scrap pieces of paper or cardboard. For more detail on how I use spray baste, go back and watch the stocking construction section. Once you're done basting, quilt as desired. Again, I'm using my Hera marker and ruler here to mark out guidelines before starting my stitching. Once you're finished quilting, trim off the excess batting and backing fabric and square up the quilt block or table runner. Bind using your preferred method, and your quilt block or table runner is finished. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this project brought you some joy in the holiday season.